The soundstage doesn't fall silent all at once. It thickens, like air before a storm. Someone stops moving. Then another. A cable hits the floor, and no one bends to pick it up. Marlon Brando's voice cuts through the space. Sharp, controlled, meant to be heard. Not a joke, not a line. A statement aimed straight at Dean Martin, delivered where everyone can see it land. This isn't rehearsal. This is a test. Technicians freeze with equipment in their hands. The director doesn't intervene. No one does, because everyone understands the rules in that moment. If Dean answers the wrong way, he doesn't lose a scene. He loses how this room will see him forever. The cameras aren't rolling yet. They don't need to be. Reputations are already on the line. Dean doesn't react. No smile, no defense. No edge in his voice when he finally looks up. And that's what unsettles the room. Because shouting would be familiar. Anger would be predictable. Silence, chosen silence, is something else entirely. In that pause, something irreversible begins. Not a confrontation, a reckoning. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The set woke up before the sun, as it always did when the schedule was tight, and nobody wanted to be the one blamed for losing an hour. Cables lay coiled like tired snakes across the floor. Coffee went cold, untouched. The soundstage smelled of dust, hot lamps, and impatience. Everyone knew whose name kept the clock running late, and whose presence kept everyone careful. Marlon Brando arrived without greeting anyone. He rarely did. He moved through the space as if it already belonged to him, reading nothing, asking nothing, eyes half closed, conserving something private. Scripts around him were treated as suggestions. Lines bent when he touched them. Directors learned quickly that resistance cost more time than surrender. Dean Martin came in quieter. No announcement. No shift in gravity. He wore the same calm expression he brought everywhere, the one people mistook for indifference. He nodded to a grip, thanked a makeup assistant, took his place without comment. To most of the crew, he was still the singer who acted on the side. Charming, reliable, unthreatening. They did not count the years. They did not count the films. They did not count the discipline it took to never miss a mark while pretending not to care. The first rehearsal started late. Brando changed a line. Not a small one. A structural one. The kind that forced everyone else to adjust or look foolish. A few people glanced at the director. He said nothing. The assistant director wrote something down and crossed it out immediately. Dean listened, processed, and responded without correcting him. No pause, no protest. The scene survived. That, more than anything, irritated Brando. On the second pass, Brando altered the rhythm. On the third, he cut a line entirely and filled the space with silence. It was deliberate. He watched his partner closely, waiting for confusion, resistance, anything that proved the mask was thin. Dean didn't blink. He adjusted his timing by a fraction. He let the silence exist. When his line came, it landed clean, unforced, exactly where the scene needed it, not where the ego wanted it. The soundstage felt tighter afterward, like a room where someone had just closed a door. People began to notice. Not openly. Quietly. A camera operator leaned forward a little more than necessary. A script supervisor stopped correcting Dean's pages. Someone whispered that this could get ugly. Someone else whispered that it already was. The director avoided eye contact with everyone equally. He needed Brando. He feared upsetting him. And yet, somewhere in the middle of that fear, a new concern formed. What would happen if the wrong man decided to push back? Another take. Another change. Brando smiled faintly this time, as if testing the edge of a blade. Dean listened, nodded once, and waited for his cue. When it came, he delivered it exactly as written. Not louder, not sharper, and the contrast made Brando's improvisation feel exposed, almost needy. Nobody said "cut" right away. The air held, lamps hummed. The moment stretched longer than comfort allowed. Dean stood relaxed, hands loose, eyes steady. Brando looked at him, really looked, for the first time that morning. Whatever was supposed to break hadn't. And for the crew, that realization landed heavy. The explosion everyone expected might not come from noise at all, but from how long one man was willing to remain absolutely still. The moment didn't arrive with a shout. It came the way pressure does, quiet, cumulative, impossible to ignore once it crossed a line. They were midway through the morning when Marlon stopped the rehearsal himself. Not a dramatic halt, just a raised hand, casual, confident, the kind of gesture that assumed permission rather than asked for it. Conversations died instantly. Even the lights seemed to buzz softer. "That doesn't work," he said, loud enough for everyone. Not to the director, not to the scene. His eyes stayed on Dean. "It's too clean, too easy. There's nothing underneath it." No one moved. A few heads turned instinctively toward Dean, as if bracing for impact. This wasn't how notes were given. Not like this. Not in front of grips, assistants, camera operators, people who would remember the moment long after the call sheet was thrown away. Dean didn't answer. He didn't smile either. He looked at Brando, then past him, as if checking something invisible. A second passed, then another. The pause stretched beyond politeness, beyond comfort. Someone shifted their weight. Someone else coughed and immediately regretted it. Brando waited, chin slightly raised, ready to fill the silence if he had to. He was used to that power, used to watching people scramble to defend themselves, to explain, to justify. Dean finally spoke, but not yet. Instead, he exhaled slowly, adjusted the cuff of his jacket, and glanced down at the script in his hand as though Brando's comment were only one detail among many. When he looked back up, his voice was calm, almost conversational. "You're right," he said. Just that. The word landed wrong. Not weak, not apologetic. Wrong in a way that disrupted the expected rhythm of confrontation. Brando narrowed his eyes, uncertain where the opening was supposed to be. Dean continued, still evenly. "If it feels easy, that's on me." A few people exchanged looks. This wasn't retreat. It didn't feel like surrender. It felt controlled. "But," Dean added, not raising his voice, not sharpening it, "if we load it with more weight than the scene can carry, it stops being honest. Then we're playing the effort, not the moment." He didn't gesture, didn't point, didn't say Brando's name. And yet, the focus shifted unmistakably. The words reframed the criticism without rejecting it, turning it into a question Brando now owned. The set listened. For the first time that day, Brando didn't interrupt. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. He looked around, not theatrically, but instinctively, and realized something had changed. The audience he'd spoken to seconds earlier was no longer his. The director cleared his throat, but didn't step in. He didn't need to. Dean glanced back at the script. "If you want to try it heavier," he said, almost casually, "we can. But we'll need to adjust the pacing before the turn. Otherwise it collapses. No challenge, no edge. Just an offer framed as logistics." Brando nodded once, slowly. Not agreement, not refusal, something closer to recalculation. They reset for another take. And as people returned to their positions, one truth settled quietly across the soundstage. Whatever this was becoming, it was no longer a one-sided performance. The shift didn't announce itself. It unfolded in increments so small they could be missed by anyone not watching closely. Dean spoke less after that exchange, not out of caution, out of precision. When he did speak, it was only to anchor something practical. Where a beat lived, how long a look could last before it turned theatrical, which silence carried meaning and which only stalled the scene. His voice never rose. It didn't need to. Marlon noticed. On the next setup, Brando adjusted his approach. Not in defiance, not in retreat. He leaned into the method harder, stretching moments, testing reactions. He dragged pauses longer than planned, letting the air thicken, watching to see if Dean would rush to fill it. Dean didn't. He let the stillness breathe. When his line finally came, it arrived without urgency, shaped by the moment rather than forcing it forward. The result was unsettling in its clarity. Brando's improvisation no longer dominated the space. It floated, unsupported, until Dean's response gave it structure. A script supervisor scribbled fewer notes. A camera operator adjusted framing on instinct, following Dean rather than anticipating Brando. These were not gestures of allegiance, just quiet acknowledgments of where the scene found its balance. During a break, Dean leaned against a prop wall, sipping water, eyes half-lidded. Brando paced nearby, restless, running lines under his breath, searching for friction. When they returned to the floor, Brando altered a moment from an earlier rehearsal, an obscure adjustment, almost trivial. Dean caught it immediately. "I remember that version," he said softly, not accusatory, not impressed, just factual. "From yesterday, third run, before lunch." Brando froze for a fraction of a second. The comment wasn't a challenge. It was worse. It revealed attention. Not passive attention, but the kind that tracked choices, stored them, understood their consequences. Dean continued, still measured. "It worked there because the scene was lighter. Here, it pulls us off the center. No judgment, no lecture, just a map." He didn't wait for approval. "If we hold the beat instead," he added, "we keep the tension where it belongs." The director looked between them, uncertain who was leading now. Brando hesitated, then nodded once. Not conceding, testing. They ran it again. This time the scene locked. Not flashy, not explosive. It settled into something solid, something that carried weight without announcing it. When the cut came, no one rushed to speak. Brando broke the silence. Again. They went again. And again. With each pass, the pattern became harder to ignore. When Dean adjusted, the scene improved. When Brando pushed without him, it wobbled. The realization didn't humiliate Brando, but it unsettled him. The ground he usually claimed through intensity was being claimed through restraint. By late afternoon, fatigue crept in. Shoulders slumped. Tempers thinned. Dean remained unchanged. Same posture. Same quiet readiness. It wasn't detachment. It was control. At one point, Brando glanced at him mid-scene, searching for something. Resistance, irritation, pride. He found none of it. Only focus. Only presence. The crew felt it too. Without discussion, without decision, they began to look to Dean for cues. When to reset, when to hold, when to breathe. Not because he demanded it, because he offered something rare on a tense set. Stability. As the day wound down, Brando stood alone near the edge of the stage, watching Dean walk back to his mark for one last take. For the first time since rehearsals began, the question wasn't how to provoke him. It was how to move him. And that realization weighed heavier than any argument ever could. The tension didn't ease overnight. It sank inward, where it could no longer be seen from a distance. The next days carried a different rhythm. On the surface, everything looked functional. Call times were met. Equipment moved on schedule. Dialogue was exchanged without incident. But underneath, something had shifted. Marlon stopped challenging with words. He began testing through behavior. Scenes stretched longer than planned. He altered tempo without warning, dragging moments until they thinned, then snapping them short when no one expected it. He moved off marks by inches, not enough to justify correction, just enough to unsettle framing. Each adjustment wore the disguise of creativity. Each one asked the same question. How far could the structure bend before it broke? Dean never went to the director. That absence was noticed. Instead, he adapted. When Marlon slowed a scene to a crawl, Dean adjusted his breathing, letting the silence gather without losing tension. When Brando rushed, Dean compressed his responses, trimming excess without trimming meaning. He didn't chase the improvisation. He absorbed it, reshaped it, returned it as something usable. The effect was subtle, but undeniable. Scenes that should have unraveled began to hold together, sometimes better than the original plan. The editor's notes grew shorter. The cinematographer stopped bracing for resets. The rhythm, fragile as it was, kept finding its center. Crew members started to track Dean's posture the way sailors watch a horizon. If he leaned in, something important was happening. If he stayed loose, the scene could breathe. No one announced this shift. It simply happened, one adjustment at a time. Marlon saw it. During one long take, he pushed harder than before, changing emotional direction midway through a line. Dean responded instantly, not by matching intensity, but by grounding it. His stillness gave Marlon's volatility a frame. Without that frame, the moment would have collapsed into noise. Cut. No one spoke. The director reviewed the playback in silence. What they saw wasn't what had been rehearsed. It was better, not louder, clearer. And the reason was obvious to anyone paying attention. Without Dean's control, the scene had no spine. Brando didn't comment. He only watched the monitor longer than usual, jaw tight, eyes sharp. This wasn't defeat. It was recognition of a threat he hadn't anticipated. By midweek, assistants quietly began asking Dean questions meant for someone else. Timing, coverage, whether a pause should be held or released. He answered briefly, never asserting authority, never assuming it was his. But the answers worked. The climate changed. Conversations dropped in volume. The set moved more deliberately. People conserved energy, sensing it would be needed later. Brando adjusted again. Less improvisation now, more precision. He was no longer trying to break the scene. He was testing whether Dean's steadiness would falter under pressure. It didn't. Each day ended the same way. Fatigue everywhere, but in one place. Dean packed up calmly, thanked the crew, left without commentary. Behind him, questions lingered unanswered. Not about talent, about control. And whether the man who had never raised his voice had quietly become the one holding the entire film together. It happened late, after most of the crew had gone. The soundstage lights were dimmed to half, throwing long shadows across unfinished sets. Someone had forgotten a radio playing softly in the distance, a voice drifting in and out through static. Dean was sitting alone on a folding chair, jacket off, sleeves rolled, reading nothing in particular. Marlon approached without announcement. No entourage, no performance, just footsteps on concrete. "Walk with me," he said. It wasn't a request, but it wasn't an order either. Dean stood, nodded once, and followed him toward a quieter corner where the sets thinned into scaffolding and bare walls. The noise of the studio faded until only the hum of electricity remained. Brando didn't look at him at first. "You know what people say," he began. His voice was level, stripped of theatricality. They say you're light, that you coast, that you don't go where things hurt. Dean waited. He didn't fill the space. I don't believe most of that, Brando continued, but I do believe this isn't a game, and I don't work with people who treat it like one. There it was, not an insult, a line drawn. Dean leaned against a beam, considering. When he spoke, it wasn't defensive. I don't treat it lightly, he said. I treat it carefully. Brando turned now, studying him. Careful doesn't always mean honest. Dean nodded slightly, accepting the premise. No, sometimes it means knowing what not to show. He paused, then added something unexpected. Not an argument, not a counterattack. When I was younger, he said, I learned pretty quickly that if you let everything out all at once, there's nothing left when it really matters. He didn't give names, didn't describe scenes, just facts, delivered without ornament. There are things you carry, Dean continued, that don't belong to the room. If you bring them in every time, they stop being useful. They turn into noise. Brando listened, really listened. His posture softened almost imperceptibly. You think I make noise, he said. I think you risk it, Dean replied. No judgment, just accuracy. The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was heavy, but stable. Two men standing in the aftermath of a long test, neither had named. Brando exhaled. You choose when to open the door. Dean nodded. That's the job. For a moment, Brando seemed to consider pushing further. He didn't. Instead, he said, quieter now, most people confuse control with fear. Dean met his eyes. Most people are wrong. They stood there a while longer, neither rushing to end the exchange. When Brando finally stepped back, the edge was gone. Not dulled, just redirected. Tomorrow, he said, we try it your way first. Dean gave a small nod. No triumph, no relief. As they parted, nothing had been settled on paper. No apologies exchanged, no ground formally conceded. But something essential had shifted. Not trust. Recognition. The day arrived already exhausted. By the time the crew gathered, shoulders were tight, voices clipped, movements economical in the way people get when they know there is no margin left. The schedule had been bled dry. One more delay would force compromises no one wanted to make. The scene waiting on the floor was the hardest one they had left. Emotionally dense, technically unforgiving, impossible to fake. The director said it plainly. We don't have room to chase this. A few takes. That's it. No one argued. The lights came up hotter than usual. Sweat formed early. Dean stood in position, eyes lowered, breathing slow, conserving energy. Across from him, Marlon was unusually still. No pacing, no murmured lines, just focus, sharpened to a point. They rolled. The first take held together, but barely. The second went deeper, slower, riding the edge of indulgence. On the third, Marlon changed the key line. Not the words, but the way it landed. He shifted the emphasis, darkened it, twisted the meaning just enough to knock the emotional logic off balance. It was intentional. For Dean, the change hit mid-beat. He had a fraction of a second to decide whether to stop, correct, or protect the scene. He chose none of those. Instead, he adjusted his response, not the text, but the rhythm. He let the altered line pass without resistance, absorbed its weight, then answered from a different place entirely. His delivery stripped the moment down, removing heat, replacing it with restraint. The contrast reframed Marlon's choice, turning provocation into vulnerability. The scene tilted, but didn't fall. Something electric passed through the space. No one breathed. The camera tracked instinctively, as if guided by the shift rather than planned for it. When the final line landed, It didn't explode. It settled. Cut. Silence. Not confusion. Not disappointment. Something heavier. The director stared at the monitor. He watched the playback once. Then again. On the second viewing, his shoulders dropped slightly, as if he'd been carrying a weight he could finally set down. "That's the one," he said. No cheers, no release, just a quiet understanding of how close they'd come to losing it, and why they hadn't. Marlon stood apart, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. His jaw worked once, then stilled. He didn't look at Dean right away. When he finally did, there was no challenge left in his expression. Only calculation. And respect. The crew reset mechanically, packing away the tension along with the equipment. No one spoke loudly. Everyone knew they had witnessed something that couldn't be repeated on command. Dean sat down, hands resting loosely on his knees, breathing steady. The fatigue finally reached him, but only now, when it was safe. That had been the moment where everything could have broken. It didn't, because one man chose not to defend himself, and in doing so, held the entire scene together when it mattered most. The end came without ceremony. By the final day, the soundstage felt hollowed out. Sets stood half dismantled, their purpose already fading. The call sheet was lighter. Fewer people lingered. The work was done, even if no one said it out loud. Dean finished early. Not because he rushed, because there was nothing left to add. He thanked the makeup assistant who had followed the production from the first week. He returned a chair to its place instead of leaving it where he'd used it. Small gestures, unnoticed unless you were watching for them. Most weren't. Marlon stood near the edge of the floor, jacket on, hands in his pockets. He watched Dean from a distance, as he had learned to do, without interruption, without agenda. When the last piece of equipment was wheeled away and the space finally cleared, he crossed the floor. No audience. No witnesses. "You don't need noise," Marlon said. His voice was low, stripped of performance. "You don't need pressure." Dean looked at him, attentive but unreadable. "That's harder than it looks," Marlon continued. "Most men I know wouldn't survive working that way." Dean considered this for a moment, then answered simply, "Most men don't try." There was no pride in it, no claim. Marlon nodded once. The gesture carried more weight than any compliment. "We were equals here," he said. Not praise, a statement of fact. Dean accepted it with the same calm he'd brought to everything else. "That's enough." They stood there a few seconds longer. Nothing more needed to be said. Whatever had been contested between them no longer required resolution. Dean picked up his coat. He left before the lights were fully shut down, walking past sets that no longer mattered, past cameras that had stopped recording long ago. Outside, the air was cooler, quieter, honest. Behind him, the studio settled into silence. No applause followed. No headlines captured what had happened there. But the balance had been struck, not through force, not through dominance, but through an absence of need. Dean didn't win. He removed the reason to compete. And in the stillness that followed, that truth carried more weight than any victory ever could.